A national federation president stands in front of press and says out loud that FIFA's own rulebook can't be trusted to protect the game. That's not a pundit talking. That's Lise Klaveness, president of the Norwegian Football Federation, one of the most respected voices in European soccer governance. And she's not talking about referees or VAR. She's talking about eligibility, about who's allowed to play for which country, and about a case that never even involved her own team on the pitch. So why is Norway's federation president picking this fight with FIFA itself? Here's the real question this video answers. When a player switches which national team he represents, there's a rule book FIFA is supposed to enforce evenly for every federation, every time. So what happens when a federation believes that rulebook wasn't applied evenly? What happens when the process looks different depending on which country is asking? That's the tension at the center of the Balogun case, and it's why this stopped being about one forward and became about whether FIFA's eligibility system can survive being tested in public. Folarin Balogun is American-born, came up through Arsenal's academy, and like a lot of dual nationality players, had a real choice to make about international football. FIFA's eligibility rules exist for exactly this. A player can switch associations under specific conditions, tied to age, caps, and consent. Norway's federation, and Klaveness specifically, became central to this story because of how the switch and the surrounding process were handled, and because Norway had its own dealings with FIFA's disciplinary machinery running in parallel. Two processes, one governing body, and a growing sense that the standard wasn't the same for everyone. So here's where it gets uncomfortable for FIFA. Eligibility switches aren't rare. Plenty of players with dual nationality change allegiance before a certain number of senior caps, and it usually happens quietly, through paperwork, with barely a headline. But Klaveness didn't treat this like routine paperwork. She went public, framing it as a test of whether FIFA applies its own rules consistently, or whether the outcome depends on which federation has more weight behind it. That's a much bigger accusation than one transfer of allegiance. That's a credibility question aimed at the entire governing structure. To understand why this landed so hard, you have to understand who's saying it. Klaveness became NFF president after speaking out publicly about human rights conditions tied to the Qatar World Cup, right on FIFA's own stage in Doha. She's not a fringe critic. She's a sitting federation president with real standing inside UEFA and FIFA's own structures. So when she says the sport's integrity is at risk over how an eligibility case was processed, other federations listen, because she's shown before she'll say the uncomfortable thing in the room where it counts. Now here's the turn. This wasn't just about paperwork timing. It was about whether the process gave every federation a fair, transparent look at the same set of facts before a decision got made. Norway's federation felt the process around the eligibility decision didn't give them that. And once a federation president says that in public, FIFA can't just quietly settle it behind closed doors anymore, because the accusation itself that the rules bend depending on who's asking is now part of the public record. So what's actually at stake here isn't one player wearing one jersey. It's whether smaller and mid-sized federations can trust that FIFA's eligibility system treats a country like Norway the same way it treats a footballing power with more political and commercial weight. Because if the answer is no, then every future eligibility case, every dual national kid deciding which flag to play under, becomes a case where the outcome might depend less on the rule and more on who's asking. This matters beyond this one case because international eligibility rules are the backbone of what makes national team football mean anything. If a federation like Norway's can stand up and say, on record, that the system's fairness is in question, and if that claim gets real traction with other federations, FIFA faces a choice. Tighten the process and make it transparent for everyone, or watch confidence in the whole eligibility framework keep eroding one dispute at a time. That's the legacy question this case forces onto the table. And if you're the kind of person who wants the tactics and the politics behind the game explained straight, without the noise, that's exactly what this channel does every week. So stick around for the next one. Here's the part that makes this genuinely different from a normal transfer window eligibility gripe. Klaveness didn't just criticize a decision. She questioned the transparency of the entire process that led to it, publicly, as a sitting federation president, aiming that criticism directly at FIFA's disciplinary and eligibility bodies. That's a level of institutional confrontation you rarely see from a federation that size, because federations usually pick their fights carefully, knowing FIFA controls funding, competition slots, and disciplinary leverage over their own national teams. So why risk that confrontation? Because Klaveness has built her entire tenure on the idea that federations shouldn't just accept FIFA's decisions quietly to protect their own standing. She did it over Qatar. She's doing it again here. And every time she does it and doesn't get punished for it, it makes it easier for the next federation president to speak up too. That's the pattern worth watching, not the single case itself. Compare that to how American sports handle eligibility, because the contrast is genuinely instructive. The NFL doesn't have a national team eligibility problem in the same sense, but it has spent decades building transparent, heavily documented processes for things like the draft, free agency, and disciplinary rulings, specifically because disputes over fairness erode trust in the league fast. The NFL's competition committee exists partly to keep the rulebook consistent and explainable, because a league where teams believe the rules bend for bigger markets doesn't survive very long as a credible competition. Soccer's international structure doesn't have that same single controlling body over player movement in the way a league does. FIFA has to referee over 200 member associations, some enormous, some tiny, all with competing interests. So a case like Balogun's isn't really about one clerical decision. It's a stress test on whether that referee, FIFA itself, can be trusted to call it the same way, no matter who's standing on which side of the whistle. And that's the honest crossover this channel keeps coming back to. American sports leagues are closed systems, built and owned by the teams themselves, so the incentive to keep rules transparent is baked into the business model. Soccer's international game is an open, sprawling federation of federations, where FIFA has enormous power but limited direct accountability to any single body that can overrule it. Klaveness's stand only works because enough people and enough federations still believe that public pressure can move an organization that size. That's a very different kind of accountability than anything the NFL has to deal with. So where does this actually land? The Balogun case itself will get resolved through FIFA's normal channels, appeals, rulings, the usual machinery. But the bigger question Klaveness put on the table doesn't resolve that easily. Once a federation president says publicly that the process wasn't fair to everyone, FIFA either has to prove transparently that it is, or it has to live with more federations saying the same thing the next time a big eligibility case comes up. That pressure doesn't just disappear because one case closes. And that's really what this story is about. Not whether one talented forward made the right choice for his career, but whether the organization that governs the entire international game can survive being asked in public by one of its own member federations to prove it's actually fair. Klaveness didn't accuse FIFA of corruption. She did something arguably more dangerous to them. She asked them to show their work. Every governing body eventually gets tested by someone willing to ask the question everyone else was too careful to ask out loud, and how it answers that question tells you what it actually is. If this kind of story is the one that keeps you thinking after the video ends, there's another governing body reckoning coming next, and it's just as uncomfortable.